Good morning to everyone. It's good morning, maybe good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you for that, Annika. And to your question, I think if we're talking to sustainable development, I think generally we all speak to the SDGs globally. How we craft and shape that is different. If we are speaking to sustainability in the context of environmental sustainability, I think the parameters remain the same globally. The emphasis and focus for us on the African continent then shifts and changes, particularly when we look at climate change. I think whilst we all are looking at how we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and how we reach net zero targets by 2050 globally, the challenge for us on the continent is around climate justice and climate finance. We're very aware of the fact that on the continent, we are, I think, the least responsible for the current challenge we face around climate change. But we are on the receiving end of experiencing very harsh weather changes that have impacted our food security, have impacted our production in the agriculture sector. But more importantly, we find that in our rural economies, people don't quite understand the shifts that have happened from a climate perspective. So we would invariably look at human-centered designs around climate change. When we talk to sustainability, we will look at biodiversity more closely in the context of food production. But we also would have to extend that beyond just the environmental sustainability and that conversation to look at SDGs and say, what are the key priorities for us on the continent that we need to focus on if we are to achieve the SDGs? And I think we can broadly agree that with the COVID pandemic, the timelines and the ambition to achieve them in 2030 have been pushed out. So I would then contextualize it along 4 areas as urgent challenges for us on the continent if we are to support or meet the SDGs, which we will not in 2030. But I also want to stress the African Agenda 2063, which is something that we also look at. But within that, I will frame 4 things and leave that on the table as key issues or areas that on the African continent are of priority, which may be different from that of the global north. The first for me is digitization. I think there is no, one of the big differences we have on the continent that hinge on our sustainable development is the lack of an access to digital inclusion. So it is widely accepted that if we do actually accelerate digitization on the continent, we'd also see acceleration in number of the SDGs that we would want to achieve. The second one is rapid urbanization. We do see a lot of our cities growing on the African continent, and they will grow exponentially. The challenge that we face, which is quite different from the global north, is that we don't have adequate service delivery. So there is need to also look at social infrastructure development and energy being a key factor for that. So it is a key priority and a focus for us on the continent, which is very different from that of the global north. Although I may add within that context that a just energy transition is a challenge across the globe. It is not unique to the African continent. It is something that is faced with the global north as well. My last area, I would say, is transforming the health systems. I think what has been brought to the fore quite significantly has been the transparency and the accountability and the lack of infrastructure of our health systems. So there is need for us to focus on that. And those 3 areas are quite aligned to what we are focusing on as the Shared Value Initiative and Shift Impact Africa. So let me pause there and say those are the 4 things that I would place on the table in discussing the topic of the day. You're on mute. The dreaded mute button. Still on mute, Annika. Still on mute.
Now?
I can hear you now. Oh, no, you've gone again. I can't hear you now.
It seems like there is a bit of a lag between clicking and unclicking. So Kirsten, I thought I would ask you to continue there and share with us what you thought if there are differences between how we see sustainability and how our priorities might be different to the global north.
Thanks, and I think Sazini did an excellent job of outlining the factors that we need to deal with across Africa, knowing that also across that Africa has different levels of development and different levels of issues that we face. It's not homogeneous across the continent, but on those 4 levels, I would agree with her that we absolutely do have big challenges in those areas. I think that one of the things that I wanted to stress and maybe just reiterate from Sazini's point is that sustainability and the SDGs in Africa, while they may fall into the same bucket as the global north, it's the way that we apply them and the way that the challenges that we're facing need to be considered is different. And it's about the balance that we need to achieve between Africa's development and achieving the SDGs, which are as essential to Africa as they are to the rest of the world, given the fact that we are experiencing the dominant effects of climate change across the continent, changing weather patterns, the roll on socioeconomic impact that it has to people, making the challenge of our basic delivery that much greater, such as healthcare systems, service delivery, meeting energy needs, growing the economy, developing energy sources, or even types of social development that fit a changing environment. Those are the types of challenges that we're dealing with. Now, those may then reflect differently in the global north, in a certain country in the global north, and it may look different, for example, in a Nigeria or in a Ghana or Uganda. But that is also not to say that there are not developments occurring in those countries that are very specific to those countries, which are very much about shared value, about developing sustainable solutions to Africa's problems. I think the added layer that we have is that we also have global commitments and global pressures that we need to be dealing with in terms of SDGs and, for example, targets that need to be met. And this is countries as well as businesses, and those are impacting on how we deliver and how we develop the projects that are occurring. So I think that one of the things that we're starting to see is that the way in which business specifically is addressing or responding to these challenges is that they are dealing with these challenges in a contextual community level with a greater understanding of what a transition needs to look like that is fit for context. And those are the types of conversations that we've been having. So while there is absolutely no argument that the SDGs are relevant, appropriate, and need to be addressed, it's about how we actually implement and the types of solutioning that we then provide within the context and communities in which we're operating in.
Is your view on all of this?
Thanks, Annika, and thanks for the invite. It's a really interesting conversation, and I'm just going to jump off Sazini and Kirsten. I feel like they've spoken a whole lot about the issues of sustainability in Africa. But the one thing, and I'll probably start off from an experience point of view. So I had the pleasure of chatting with a few managers from companies in South Africa. And one of the questions I posed to them was around sustainability and what they understand by sustainability. And it will surprise you that a majority, a major part of the class thought sustainability was about financial sustainability. And these are managers in like a top corporate in the country or on the continent. And I guess the reason why I highlight this point is in as much as, and I guess this is to Kirsten's point as well, it's almost like we are at different levels, so to speak, as far as understanding sustainability and understanding the imperative of the Sustainability Development Goals. I had a look at the GlobeScan report for sustainability for 2021. And one of the key parts that stuck out to me was, experts were surveyed on their thoughts around sustainability, and only 6% of these experts from 72 countries were from Africa. And so when you see the list of issues that are popping up, like, okay, these are the sustainability issues, it's about climate change, it's about, those were the top issues listed on that list. The bottom issues on the list included things like supply chains, and supply chains are so important for Africa. If you think about the cocoa industry, a lot of the cocoa is either from, like the origin of cocoa is either from Ghana or from Ivory Coast. And then if you check the wage of the people who actually work on these farms and provide the cocoa, it's almost like, they're barely able to have a living wage. So it's like corporates, there's a need to really pay attention to value chains and pay attention to supply chains and pay attention to making those supply chains sustainable. So what are the kind of labor conditions that the people, the farmers, what are the kind of labor conditions that they have to deal with? I'm not saying that climate change isn't very important, but there are issues that are closer around social sustainability that an average African has to deal with. When within this context, it's almost like we're at different levels. So I had the pleasure of chatting with a supply chain manager, and one of the highlights he came up with is it's like these sustainability goals, these requirements, these compliance listings, it's relevant, it's valid. However, when I go back to my farmers and I try to get them to be able to meet these requirements, I'm not able to compete. He's not able, as a sustainable supplier of food, he's not able to compete with global suppliers. So this brings in the trickiness of global supply chains and how global companies affect the life and living wages and the lifestyles of average African farmers. So I guess I'm, building on what has been said, highlighting that, there's a need to really understand how socially sustainable things become and how we address those issues. Yes, to Sazini's point, there's a need for digitization. As a corporate, it's very difficult to be able to know every point in your supply chain. And I think there's a big role for digitization in that space, because having access to transparent information about different supply chains provides an opportunity to be able to know which of these suppliers should I be working with, which of these suppliers pay attention to the needs of the farmers, pay attention to the local issues, pay attention to inequality in the space that they operate. So that's going to be my jump off point for the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tess. And I think what we've had in the last few minutes is a really robust conversation focusing on, I would call it, differences of how we see the sustainability agenda and how it unfolds and the importance of it vis-a-vis how the external global north, for instance, might see that. And it was reflected in a comment made during the first session yesterday afternoon, where one of the audience members said, we really have to develop a new narrative for sustainability, which is far more inclusive, which is going to also include the voices and the needs and the fears and expectations of the global south, you know, because we are just not at that place where they are, in terms of looking at this piece of work that's got to get done, and so on. So I was just wondering, what do you believe are the? It feels to me like there are definite differences. What are the implications of those different differences that we are identifying, and what are the implications thereof for the sustained work around achieving the SDGs, etc., all of the stuff that we set out that we want to achieve? What are those implications? Kirsten, go. Do you want to go? I see you were nodding.
I was nodding. I do think that the implications are incredibly important. It's how the rubber hits the road, right? So it's how it's actually rolled out in terms of each country and the policy positions that people take, as well as then the role that community plays, business plays, government plays, and how it all comes together. And to also reiterate Tessa's point, I feel like Tessa, Zini, and I are maybe one person at the moment speaking with the same voice, is that it's in terms of considering how sustainable goals are applied and practically adopted within the countries in which we operate. It's a nuance, it's a subtle approach. It is not a hammer that you can just say one thing is going to solve for this problem. It is about a confluence of factors. It's about what the policy environment looks like. It's about the way that the strategic objectives of countries are set up and how they are pushed and dealt with. It is how business gets behind those strategic objectives, and it's about the buy-in from communities and the type of role that communities play within these. And that then starts to have a conversation about when we really speak about what a just transition is. And I'm not going to say just energy transition, I'm going to say just transition, because I think it's not just about the energy transition. It's about the transition in terms of economic development that we need to be seeing across the continent. And that justness and sense of making sure that it doesn't entrench some of the problems that we face in the long term, such as levels of inequality, food insecurity, lack of skills development and education. Those are the types of things that we need to be grappling with and having very honest conversations about. Because sometimes what happens is that when we have a conversation at a very high level, that can turn quite abstract about, I'm going to use an example, for instance, if you talk about renewable energy as one of the solutions to the energy transition, you don't then speak about the added implications for the social development practicalities that happen there. What about the skills development, the education levels, the jobs that are created or not created, the types of urbanization versus ruralization that occurs based on where these are located, the minerals that are involved, what impact it has on the mining, the economy of those countries, and what are those relationships like in terms of a diplomatic sense. So I think the integrated systemic way of looking at a transition in a just way needs to be something that Africa needs to have a very loud voice on. It is something that can be done, but it cannot be done in a blunt manner. It needs to be done in a nuanced manner, in a way that is done balancing out the needs and requirements of the countries and communities in which we operate.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to add, in terms of, and maybe this speaks to the point around policy and policymakers and the institutions that actually guide and determine, the rules of the game, in an environment where in some cases, these formal institutions are weak. So, being able to enforce some rules, it falls along the wayside. So I strongly believe that there's a massive role for the private sector. And this is because, in our context, it almost feels like in order to meet up the weakness of state capacity, the private sector steps in. So you'd go into spaces where, the government has failed to provide roads or failed to provide adequate security. And then there's a private company that's managing that and people are having to pay for that. So I think even with sustainability, the implication of the nuance and the context is that there's a big role for corporates to play. And it's a big role around, what are the and this is obviously a role that fits into what the individual does as well. It's like, what is important for the company? What kind of companies are being built? Because sustainability is not cheap. There's a challenge of finances. And as an average corporate, you want to be able to make returns on your investment. So it's really around starting to reverse that mindset in the minds of corporates to really see how am I influencing the social lives of people within the context? How am I being able to stand in to address the failures of the policymakers or failures of the institutions that are supposed to guide. With that said, if we come back to reporting, for example, corporates, for example, in South Africa, and I think in a lot of African countries, are not required to disclose their ESG. It's not a mandatory report, it's optional. Yes, there are guidelines to how you disclose sustainability and how you push for sustainability initiatives in your company, but it's not compulsory. This then means that, this can be, the drive for sustainability can be driven from it has to be something that's inherent in the companies. And I think, the implication for me from this conversation and from the work I do is really around corporates playing a more purpose-led role in trying to meet the weaknesses of the context of the institutional context that they exist within.
I cannot agree with you more. And I would like to ask Shazini, we have about 10 minutes left of this conversation, and I'd like her to think broadly with all her experience across a number of stakeholder sectors, to start the conversation, because I'd love to end off this conversation with something positive, something that we as a group can say, you know what, maybe we should suggest this to the powers that be as potential things to look at to really continue the momentum or even build better momentum. So we see the differences, we see the challenges, we see I want to say, what's happening here and what's happening north. What can we do as sustainability practitioners, sustainability advocates, people who find ourselves within different types of organizations? What can we do to contribute and create momentum? And Shazini, I think in my head, it's a very big question. So I'm bowling a big question to you to start the conversation, and then the others, please just chip in as we go along.
I think my panelists have painted the picture of the challenge and the opportunity. I think as they've already articulated, a collaborative approach is the only way for us to tackle the issues that we face. And I particularly like the SDGs because they speak to the fact that it is not a government responsibility. It is a combined responsibility, be it the civil society organizations, private sector, and government. And our ability to achieve them actually requires courageous leadership, but accountability and transparency to the different societies. So I think for me, the call to action would be to increase the number of collaborations that we're seeing in the different countries, whether we're looking at climate change or we're looking at urbanization or we're looking at the ESG agenda. How are we working in a collaborative effort to create the systemic change we want to see in the countries we operate in? I'm currently working with a team that is looking at how we advocate for shared value across the continent. I do believe that one of the key approaches or management styles, strategy approaches, is how we create shared value. You see, with shared value, it speaks to identifying the social challenges as a corporate or as private sector. Once you've identified the key social challenges in your community, you do look at the business opportunity. So it is about the triple bottom line and using your own corporate assets and expertise to deal with those challenges. So I find that in the Shared Value Africa initiative, we've got a number of member companies. Exxaro, for example, which is a coal company, their strategy has really looked at how, as much as they contribute to the economy of South Africa through Eskom and making sure they keep our lights on, they're using fossil fuel. So how do you reduce exposure to that? And they have embedded a strategy to look at how to do that. And we have a conversation on Friday around that with them. And then you turn around, we've got Nedbank as one of our members, and they're looking at how to finance renewable energy. But within that context, we also have the global development organizations, the World Food Programme, that obviously for us are highlighting the point around the Ukraine war and the food security and the lack of wheat and corn and grain going into more, well, being reduced into 41 countries now, and that there's food insecurity will increase incredibly in some of the countries on the continent and around the world. So within that context, you begin to see the importance of a collaborative approach, the importance of working as private-public partnerships. And you mentioned earlier that I referred to myself as a tri-sector leader. Correction, I actually did not. I was speaking somewhere and someone referred to me as a tri-sector leader. And I said, what is that? I said, you've worked in government, corporate, and NGOs. So you've got public-private partnerships and you understand how the three sectors work. So it is within that context where I think more social engineers, as the people on this panel are speaking, need to participate quite actively in how in our communities, in our society, we contribute to the discourse around how we create shared value in the different parameters we face or in the different sectors. I will close off by saying, the role of private sector cannot be, I cannot underscore it enough. It's so, so important. There are companies out there that are bigger than the GDP of most countries. And if you just take that into perspective, you start realizing that actually their voice is very important. And most, if not all, need to be purpose-led and start looking at the social agenda as a business agenda. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, of the other panelists, Kirsten, would like to add to that.
Yeah,
that conversation.
Anneke, if I might, thanks, Azini. I think that's a brilliant way to close. I absolutely agree with the need for collaborations and partnerships, especially because we are within a context where there is a lot of resource constraint. So, you know, there's a need to bring resources together. But just finishing off from where I started, I think there's also, going forward, there's also a big role for us as individuals to play, because, you know, in a value chain, it ends with the consumer. And a lot of times it's, as a consumer, are you active? Are you sustainably active and requiring from the producers and from the corporates to do what they need to do? So there's a need to create awareness in the individuals and, you know, in that space, like drive a change of mindset so that, you know, we can play a more active role in addressing the issues that face us, that loom over us, really. So with that, that will be like my closing point, and I'll give 4 minutes to Kirsten to speak as well.
I think then what I'd like to do is just pull back to something that you said, and which is quite frightening, was the conversation that you'd been having, Tess, with some managers when they considered what sustainability is. And then linking that back to what Sazini was talking about having organizations that are purpose-led, but then also large organizations that have a role to play and have a responsibility to actually be part of the solution. And it occurs to me that obviously those interlink, because as an individual level, your levels of knowledge and awareness and the impact that it's having in your environment is also going to translate into the business that you do and the type of work that you do and the awareness that you take. And it's very interesting. I mean, it's for us as a bank across the continent, when we look at our top risks, the top risks in terms of are sustainability risks. Those are the top risks for us. They're sustainability risks, and you can link them into the E, the S, the G. Those are the risks that we face, and those are the ones that we're grappling with. So while those are risks that we have to manage, you can manage those risks as an organization, but you have to have the flip side of what is your strategic business direction and I would say purpose, to then say, what are you doing to address it, or how are you actually playing in this environment? How are you actually participating and contributing in the environment? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the business that you have to do has to be directly a sustainable business. It's not about everybody needs to become a renewable energy producer. It's the how you do business. It's what business you choose to do. It's how you roll yourself out and how you make those balances and how you consider the environments in which you're in. And I think that as that becomes more apparent, I think actually what you're going to find is that some of those managers are going to start realizing that some of what their businesses do are sustainable already. They just haven't used the language to actually get it across. And if they can then understand the language and bring those two together, then you have something that becomes a lot more purposeful, a narrative that becomes something that we can use across the continent to be able to say what suits us and what our biggest challenges are, and to be able to say how we can contribute to our strategic objectives. It's a big ask, Annika, it was a big question, and it is something that is quite abstract, and I think we know what the principles are in terms of how we need to get it done. I just think that sometimes what we deal with is the challenges of what receives precedence at any one time. So we across the continent, we were, I would say, probably if I have to generalize, we were dealing with climate change issues. Then the war in the Ukraine occurred. That changed a number of dynamics, which affected Africa as well, which we then needed to consider. And you have to be able to be flexible enough and agile enough to consider what those are and anticipate the risks that those are going to place on us as a continent, and think about how we develop our resilience and how we actually start adapting. And I think those are some of the biggest challenges that we face as individuals, corporates, and governments.